Hello, this is KYC News. We provide you with the most up-to-date and reliable information for the day. First and foremost, we want to achieve perfect health with a sincere desire. The world's arsenals will be shaped by the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The newsstands in Seoul were awash with new warnings about a possible nuclear test by North Korea. Lee Jae-sang, a 28-year-old office worker, had already formed an opinion about how to respond to North Korea's rapidly expanding capability to launch nuclear bombs across borders and oceans while walking down the street. Our country should pursue a nuclear program as well. Also, prepare for the possibility of a nuclear conflict. According to a February study, 3 out of 4 South Koreans support Lee's desire. It's a point that non-nuclear power citizens and politicians are voicing more frequently in a destabilizing period in more than a half-century of global nuclear non-proliferation efforts, exacerbated by the daily example of nuclear Russia tearing apart non-nuclear Ukraine. Non-nuclear states are reconsidering their positions in Asia. The area is home to an increasingly aggressive North Korea, China, Russia, and Iran, 3 nuclear powers and 1 near-nuclear power. But it lacks the nuclear umbrella and broad defense alliance that have shielded NATO members for decades. Vulnerable countries will contemplate preserving or pursuing nuclear weapons in light of the lessons learned from Ukraine, particularly whether Russia succeeds in swallowing large chunks of Ukraine while displaying its nuclear arsenal to keep other nations at bay, according to security experts. They argue that how successfully the US and its allies persuade other partners in Europe, the Persian Gulf, and Asia to believe in the US-led nuclear and conventional arsenals rather than pursue their own nuclear weapons is just as crucial. They will say to their home audiences, "Please support our nuclear armament because look what happened to Ukraine, right?" says one leader concerned about unfriendly, nuclear-armed neighbors. Mariana Budharan, a researcher at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government's project on managing the atom, agreed. Budharan was schooled on how to treat radiation burns and other probable nuclear war casualties as a schoolgirl in Soviet-era Ukraine in the 1980s, at a period when the country hosted around 5,000 of the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons. Following the disintegration of the Soviet Union, her country abandoned nuclear weapons development in favor of economic aid, integration with the West, and security assurances. Ultimately, I believe the outcome of this battle will have a significant impact on how we interpret the value of nuclear weapons, Budharan said. The U.S. military is reassuring key partners around the world who are facing nuclear-armed adversaries. White-hot ballistic missiles arced through the night sky near the North Korean border this month, when the U.S. and South Korea conducted their first joint ballistic test launches in 5 years. It was a scathing rebuke to North Korea's launch of at least 18 ballistic missiles so far this year. President Joe Biden and U.S. generals, diplomats, and troops are relocating to countries bordering Russia and oil-producing countries bordering Iran in Europe and the Persian Gulf. Biden and his closest aides promised that the U.S. would stand firm against nuclear threats from Iran, North Korea, and others. President Xi Jinping of China is combining an aggressive foreign strategy with one of his country's largest nuclear armament programs. Former Asian officials have used Ukraine as an example of why more non-nuclear countries should consider adopting nuclear weapons or hosting U.S. nuclear weapons. Neither Japan nor South Korea, in my opinion, are eager to acquire nuclear weapons. It will be extremely painful politically and internally divisive. What, on the other hand, are the alternatives? At a March Defense Forum, ex-Singapore Foreign Minister Bilahari Kaushik warned the gathering. The example set by Russia's invasion of Ukraine is another nail in the coffin for those wishing for North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons, according to Terence Rohrig, a national security professor at the U.S. Naval War College, who spoke at another defense symposium in April. Ukraine will be another example to North Korea of governments like Iraq and Libya that handed up their nuclear weapons capabilities, and look what happened to them, Rohrig added. Ukraine never had nuclear weapons capable of being detonated, at least none that it could use independently. Ukraine now has the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal, thanks to the demise of the Soviet Union. Ukraine, on the other hand, was not in command of the situation. In the 1990s, as it negotiated its place in the post-Soviet world and the destiny of the Soviet arsenal with the US, Russia, and others, it was left with a weak hand. According to Budharan, Ukraine has received assurances but no guarantees in terms of security. One such promise, signed in 1994, was described as a piece of paper by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The United States has supplied atomic. Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi was forced to give up his country's primitive nuclear weapons development by the West in 2003. Gaddafi's son Saif al-Islam told researcher Malfred Brautheghammer a few years later that his father's major concern was that Western nations will back an uprising against him. And then, lo and behold, when you get to 2011, you see what happened, said Brautheghammer, who is now a professor of nuclear and security strategy at the University of Oslo. NATO intervened in a 2011 internal rebellion against Gaddafi at the request of the US. His convoy was hit by a NATO warplane. The Libyan leader was kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and assassinated by rebels. In Iraq, the United States played a key role in pressuring Saddam Hussein to abandon his nuclear weapons program. The US then deposed Saddam Hussein in 2003, claiming he was reassembling a nuclear weapons program. Saddam Hussein was hanged 3 years later, when Iraq was still under US control. The assassinations and deaths of Middle Eastern leaders have cast a pall over North Korean denuclearization efforts. The Trump administration often invoked the Libya model, and Vice President Mike Pence threatened Kim Jong-un with Gaddafi's fate, leading to the collapse of rare US-North Korean talks in 2018. North Korea's government reacted, ignorant and dumb. According to Brautheghammer, Russia's invasion of Ukraine just underscores to certain countries, at least, that if you have a nuclear weapons program and you're kinda far along with it, giving it up is a terrible idea. About 13,000 nuclear weapons are held by the world's 9 nuclear powers: the United States, Russia, France, China, the United Kingdom, Pakistan, India, Israel, and North Korea. Israel denies having a nuclear weapons program. Historically, the major nuclear powers have endeavored to regulate which countries are allowed to join the club. Iran and North Korea, for example, are isolated and sanctioned for proceeding notwithstanding. South Korea and Saudi Arabia are among the countries most likely to consider nuclear weapons, according to nuclear experts. In 2018, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman promised to acquire nuclear weapons as soon as Iran did. At the April forum, Jessica Cox, the head of NATO's nuclear directorate, said it's surprising that more countries haven't obtained a weapon. If you look at it from a historical standpoint, it's hard to believe that in the 1950s and 1960s, there would be fewer than 10 nuclear-armed nations in the world 70 years later. NATO's nuclear deterrent, 30 states sharing responsibility and decision-making for a nuclear arsenal that deters assaults on them all, made the difference in Europe, according to Cox. Many people believe Ukraine made the right decision in opting out of a nuclear-armed future in order to avoid possible isolation. Ukraine had 3 decades to integrate with the global economy and form relationships with powerful nations that are now assisting in its defense against Russia. Bud Heron realized as a young woman in Ukraine after the 1990s accords that her own position, then in business development, was supported by the Clinton administration as part of the West's nuclear deal benefits to Ukraine. If Ukraine wins, it will send a message that nuclear weapons are useless, she remarked. However, if Ukraine falls apart, the story would be extremely different, she predicted. Foreign fighters who entered Ukraine to fight Russia are facing a gruesome death at the hands of separatist authorities who want to send a message to their families. After surrendering in the besieged port city of Mariupol in April, British citizens Aidan Aslin and Sean Pinner, as well as Moroccan man Brahim Saadaan, were condemned to death by a pro-Moscow court in the Donetsk People's Republic earlier this month. The 3 was sentenced for operating as mercenaries and attempting to topple the government by the court, which is not internationally recognized. The ruling provoked international uproar, with the European Court of Human Rights urging Russia to stop the execution. However, in a rant shown on Russian state television, nationalist MP Alexei Zervlyov labeled the 3 men betards and threatened to execute them. "I admire the DPR's commitment to international duties," he remarked. "According to what I've been told, the shooting will take place using a British firearm and a British bullet. The bullet would then be transported to British relatives, who will be forced to pay in rubles." On Thursday, the European Court of Human Rights advised Russia to guarantee that the death punishment imposed on the foreign mercenaries was not carried out. The court issued an emergency order because the applicants would otherwise face a genuine risk of irreversible injury, according to the court. Russia announced on Friday that around 2,000 foreign mercenaries have been slain in Ukraine since Russian President Vladimir Putin's invasion began. According to Russia's defense ministry, 6,956 mercenaries and weapons specialists from 64 nations have arrived in Ukraine since the crisis began, with 1956 already destroyed. According to the announcement, another 1,779 people have departed Ukraine. According to the report, Poland was the absolute leader among European countries in terms of combatants sent to Ukraine, followed by Romania and the United Kingdom. Mercenaries from Canada, the United States, and Georgia were also singled out. The number of foreign fighters is declining, according to the ministry, and many are departing Ukraine against the backdrop of the Kyiv regime's escalating number of military failures and enormous daily losses in manpower and equipment. The 3 men sentenced to death by the pro-Russian court have their heads shaved behind white bars in photographs. After the sentence was handed down, Aslin's grandmother told the BBC that she is not giving up hope. The situation, according to Pamela Hall, is heartbreaking. "The clock is ticking," she said. "I need to be optimistic. I am confident that it will be resolved in due time, and that peace will reign in Ukraine."